was cool. No, but that stuff, the agents working for each side, trying to steal each other's secrets and trying to, sometimes ferreting knowledge back and forth, all that existed. The Cold War is also fought in an intense competition for arms. Who can build the most, whether it's nuclear missiles or tanks, bombs. In the 1950s especially, the United States and the Soviets would build up their military forces to a rate of just tremendous capacity. The Cold War will cost both sides, like I said, trillions of dollars. And so technology, weapons, a lot of technology even comes out of the Cold War. I'm going off on tangents here, I'm sorry, but something as simple as cell phones, GPS, microwaves, all that's Cold War technology. That in the military, I don't know what they're developing now, but let me just tell you, I was on a model of Air Force One, the plane that the president flies on. And this is up in Seattle. They have the Air Force One, like the old one from the 1960s. This is 1963 when John F. Kennedy was still president. They had a microwave on that thing. Now, I don't know when were microwaves starting to be mass marketed to American households? It wasn't in the 60s. It's like the late 1970s. So the military is always developing technology like almost 20 years ahead of what the culture is going to get. Like the internet, that's a Cold War development. No, it wasn't invented by Al Gore, okay. 1967, the internet was developed by universities to communicate with each other scientifically, to share knowledge. And of course, here we are in our World Wide Web dependent civilization 40, 50 years later. The Cold War will also be fought in terms of space. You've got the Soviets that will beat us into space. We'll go specific on that later with Sputnik, the first satellite. The Russians will put up animals into outer space, like the first dog. First dog, Laika, that's her name. You don't have to know that for the quiz. It's good Jeopardy stuff. But it's pretty cool. The dog actually did make it back in one piece. Sputnik did. But both sides will try to do that. Of course, the United States, depending on what you think, will definitely get to the moon. And then in third world countries, the Cold War will be fought. Some great examples are perhaps Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, where instead of fighting each other directly, we'll have different armies that we're supporting fight each other. Like this true story, which is sickeningly true. In the 1970s, the Soviets are propping up a communist government in Afghanistan, right? As they did, and the United States wanted to topple that. And so we trained a very special group of freedom fighters led by Osama bin Laden. Yes, we trained him. And then little did we know, 30 years later, Al-Qaeda, Twin Towers. I don't know if the United States was thinking that far ahead. But that's a man that we trained. I can give you another example, Iraq. The United States funded and gave weapons to an Iraqi dictator. Does anyone know the name of that very famous Iraqi dictator? Saddam Hussein. The United States gave him technology like chemical weapons. Wait a second. Didn't we go to war in Iraq in 2003 to rid Iraq of chemical weapons? Could these possibly be the same chemical weapons the U.S. government gave Saddam Hussein? Oh, they very well could. So In the Cold War, sometimes you're friends with people at certain points, and other times you're not. It just depends on who gets the support. But the Saddam Hussein thing, Osama bin Laden, all that is well documented and true. The United States will even go into third world countries and just blatantly assassinate leaders. Like in Guatemala in 1954. Guy gets elected president, a guy named Jacobo Arbenz. He's a socialist, which is kind of like communism. The United States sends in some troops to basically assassinate him. The United States did things like that throughout the world in the Cold War. We did some pretty dirty things in the Cold War. So did the Soviets. Blood is on everybody's hands, but so just some images and visuals here. This lovely couple is an example of the espionage and spying I just talked about. We've got the Rosenbergs, who were put on trial for stealing the atomic bomb secrets from the Manhattan Project and sending it to the Soviet Union. They were executed by electric chair in the early 1950s. But just the fact that there were spies that were bought and paid for by the Soviets really did their part to scare Americans into believing that this was a struggle that wasn't just, nation on nation. This was a daily struggle. Another example, the launching of Sputnik in 1957, where the Russians put a satellite into outer space, which is very scary. In a little while, I'll talk a little bit more about Sputnik. But the impact of that is that the Russians now have a capacity to put a satellite onto a missile and launch it into outer space. If they can put a satellite onto a missile, what else could they possibly put on a missile? You guys know the answer to that. What do you think? Nuclear warheads, yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's not going to be good. We've got to do something about that. So there's a lot of fear in the Cold War, fear that the other side has the advantage. This is one of my favorite posters. It says, trained by the CIA and funded by the American taxpayer. Yes, Osama bin Laden, who was trained by the United States government. Another example, of course, the nuclear arms race. Who can build the most bombs and missiles and all of that kind of stuff. So really, that's what the Cold War is all about. Now, for a little kid growing up like me in the 1980s, when I was playing with, Transformers and G.I. Joe and stuff, and worried about the future, a lot of the stuff that I remember from my childhood is very Cold War influence. So this next slide, you'll have to excuse me. It's just a little fun and kind of funny, actually. In fact, you'll probably recognize some of these things. In the popular media, the Cold War often changed our culture to reflect the fear that Americans had about a future Soviet takeover, or a future in which communism was going to take over. But let me get to all this crazy stuff. So starting in the upper, I know you're like, I want to play Contra now. The upper left-hand corner, we've got different movies, and in the right-hand corner, different movies that spoke to a future with communism. This was one of the movies in the 1950s called The Red Menace, in which communists take over the United States. Same idea almost 40 years later with a movie called Red Dawn. Now, there was two movies made about Red Dawn. One of them had to do with the Russians invading the United States, and the other had to do with North Koreans invading the United States after the Cold War was over. There was a movie when I was a kid named War Games. Has anybody ever seen that movie? That was one of the scariest movies, because it's a movie where basically an American kid hacks into the computer system of the Pentagon and starts a nuclear war with the Soviets. That was scary. I mean, my God. I saw that and I was like, oh no. This is not, can that really happen? Can we launch all these nuclear? When I was a kid, we had this thing called a Nintendo. This is back in the day, right? Contra was a game that was all based on in Nicaragua. The United States was funding a group of freedom fighters that were fighting against communism called Contras. And they made a video game about it. I can still tell you the code to get 30 free men on that if you're interested. We'll hang out later after the game. Not after the game, you know what I mean. Also just space, the whole idea of outer space, the whole idea of taking the Cold War into outer space with something in the 1980s called Star Wars, named after the greatest film ever made, of course. But whatever, that's just some stuff that I remember. It affected people in their daily lives too, in terms of what people were building in their backyards. An example would have been a few years after the Cold War started in 1945, people would buy, how do I say it? They would go to like their equivalent of Home Depot, which they didn't have back then, and they would buy kits that would show you how to make a fallout shelter in your backyard that you could take your family, dig deep into your in your backyard and take your family for a period of time in case you wanted to have them safe. So all of this was going on, the Cold War did affect people. It probably didn't affect people living in a place like Fresno, though. But it probably affected people living in big cities that were bigger targets. I mean, Fresno, Soviets are probably not looking at us when you compare us to, say, New York or San Francisco or something like that, right? Like a big city. So it kind of depended on where you lived, and that might have dictated the amount of fear that you might have had. So why did it start? What's up with that? How come we couldn't have world peace after World War II? Well, there's so many reasons. And let me get to the big ideas. Hopefully this will help you next week as you study and read for the quiz too. But it had to do with the superpowers. So, to really summarize it and boil it down for you, the two superpowers at the end of World War II disagree on fundamentally everything. Okay? They disagree on how to reconstruct the world after the war is over. They don't see eye to eye when it comes to, okay, for example, what's going to be the future of Eastern Europe? Right? The United States wants Eastern Europe to be free, to have free elections. The Soviet Union does not want that because they have experienced World War II in a way that the United States has not experienced. The Soviet Union lost 20 million people in World War II just from the German military, and they wanted to make sure that they would never be attacked again. The United States didn't understand that. We thought they were being selfish by wanting to take over Eastern Europe. The United States had different views about what Japan should look like after World War II. We wrote Japan's constitution after World War II. Did you know that? The Soviet Union didn't see eye to eye with us on that either. The Soviet Union didn't like the fact that we had an atomic bomb. In fact, maybe one of the reasons, secret reasons, Harry Truman wanted to drop the bomb was to show the Russians like, hey, look, we know